training online course. I want to thank everybody for being a part of this, and I think you're going to get a lot of good information out of this to help you kind of understand what you need to be doing for your fitness and performance training in order to improve your golf game. So these 5 pillars don't necessarily go in order of importance, although I will say pillar number 1, which is what we're going to talk about in this session, building a strength base, is probably the lowest hanging fruit for most golfers I see, regardless of level. I work with golfers all the way from the professional level, high level amateurs, high school, juniors, and then even your kind of weekend warrior club golfers, and they all 99.9% of them still need to get stronger. So I would probably put building a strength base at number 1, and then or 1A, and then everything else kind of at 1B for most golfers. So let's jump right in. So before we kind of get in deep into building a strength base, I do want to talk about RPE-based training, or rate of perceived exertion. This is what I use with my clients and have my clients use themselves to determine how hard or how easy a set is, a weight is, in order to determine when to go up, when to back down. So we'll scroll down. You can see this here that I've highlighted. This is kind of the area that we're going to work in. So if we're doing a bench press, a squat, whatever these exercises that we're going to get into today, this is kind of how we want to be working. So we probably want to be starting our first working set. So that means we've probably done 1 or 2 warm-up sets at around a 7.5, 7 to 7.5. And we want to be finishing around a 8.5, 9. So our last set, let's say we're doing 3 sets of 6. That last set of 6, you should really feel like maybe you could have got 7 or 8 as your max. I always like to leave 1 or 2 in the tank. I don't really like training to our max because just this more from a risk factor and a safety factor. You know, if you're training with a partner, or you got a spotter, things like that, you can push a little more. But if you're training on your own, it's definitely better to leave a few in the tank. But you still want to make sure your intensity levels are pretty high. So when it comes to strength training, generally for all our strength exercises, we want to be working in around the 6 to 10 rep range and 3 to 5 sets. And then using that RPE of around, 7.5, 8 to 9 in those sets. So that last set should be finishing around a 9. That first set should be starting around 7.5 to 8 with whatever weight you're using. And it should be challenging you in that rep range of 6 to 10. So another way of determining when you should go up or go down is if you can easily get 10 or more, probably time to bump the weight up. If you struggle to get 6, especially on your first set, then you may need to stay there next time or potentially go down. And when we talk about a strength base, we're going to separate this into upper and lower body movements. And so we're going to start with the lower body first. So the lower body was really 2 basic movements. There's squatting and hinging. And then we'll talk about the single leg versions of both, which will be your lunges for squatting. So the main difference is in the squat, our pelvis is moving more vertical, more straight up and down, not a lot of forward and back movement. So if you think about it, you're trying to sit down in between your knees. Whereas at the hinge, there's more of a horizontal movement, more of a forward-backward movement. So the pelvis is moving more forward and back. So you're trying to sit the pelvis back, towards a wall or towards something. There will be some vertical movement, but not as much. So there's less knee bend. In the squat, we're trying to drop our pelvis below our knees. In the hinge, we're trying to keep the pelvis above our knees. So when we get into the squat, there's multiple variations. And so that's why, people tell you, well, I can't squat. If you can stand up and sit down in a chair, you can squat. You just need to find the best variation that works for you. So I usually start people with a box squat if they have 0 experience, and that's basically squatting to a surface. That could be a chair, a bench, something that, somewhere around maybe 16 inches high at the lowest to maybe 20 inches high at the highest. And again, that's going to be dependent on your height and leg length. But it's a comfort zone there. So, the worst case scenario, you're just sitting down on the box, and it gives you something to kind of aim at to make sure you are controlling that depth that works for you. So not everybody's going to squat in a full range of motion, nor do they need to. The more the better, but some people can't tolerate that, or they don't want to start with that from a mobility standpoint or a pain or discomfort standpoint. So we find a range you can work in, and we start there. So from there, usually the first variation I give people is a goblet squat. And so, and just for your information, you're going to have access to this PDF as well as all the links, so you can run through the videos of this. This is more me kind of taking you through this to explain everything a little deeper than what's on the page. And then you'll have access to all these videos and these links to be able to visualize these things. So a goblet squat is generally the easiest thing for most people to do. It's where you're holding a dumbbell or kettlebell in front of your chest, and you're going to squat down, squat to a box, or just perform the squat movement. It's a beginner movement, and you can load these fairly heavy for most people, but that is the main limitation with the goblet squat is, you're only going to have a heavy enough dumbbell or a heavy enough kettlebell. And once that becomes easy, then it's time to progress to the barbell squats. And so these are going to be front and back squats. So not everybody necessarily gets to these and needs to get to these, and that's fine. But for people that want to get a higher level of strength, this is the next step. So I prefer front squats over back for golfers just because it's not as much axial load on the spine. But both can be beneficial, and the limitation to front squats is you can't load them as heavy as back squats, so you're not going to get as strong on those. But you can still load them pretty heavy, and it's going to bring in more of your anterior core, work on more keeping upright posture. But not everybody is comfortable with the front squat or can get into the proper rack positions to hold the front squat. But that is usually the first place I try to take my athletes when progressing them from the goblet squat. When we talk about the back squat, there's two variations, a high bar and a low bar. And so really the difference is the high bar sits a little higher, more on top of your shoulders, where the low bar sits a little more kind of underneath the shoulder line on the spine of your scapulas, or kind of on top of your scapulas. The main difference with these is the low bar is a little better for limited mobility, those with limited mobility in the hips and ankles, because you are performing a little more of a hinge type movement in the squat. Whereas the high bar, think of your kind of Olympic lifters or people that kind of squat and their rear end drops all the way down. Those people that can do that can, generally high bar squat's going to be better. There really is no preference. Low bar, usually you can tend to load a little heavier, but it's more kind of what feels good to you. Same thing with foot position, stance width. There really is no right and wrong. Generally, you kind of want a little bit of your toes turned out, but play with it. Some a little narrower. Some people like it a little wider. Personally, I have one foot a little more forward than the other because my left hip, I have some issues with it and restrictions. And so, I still try to maintain equal foot pressure. And for me, that's what helps me to maintain that is have my left hip a little bit more forward than the right. Left foot a little bit more forward than the right. So a lot of it is just finding what you're comfortable with while maintaining the basic mechanics of the squat, which you'll see in the videos. So the single leg version of the squat is the lunge or the split squat. The benefit of these is you can obviously target a little more, quote unquote, stability training, as well as you can tease out some side to side differences. So if one leg is stronger than the other, you might not always notice that in the squat, and you can tend to rely on the stronger leg and just continue to get that leg stronger. Whereas in single leg variations, that'll show up pretty quickly if there's a difference. And so you can find ways to kind of work on that weaker side to bring it back up, either by adding some more reps, adding an extra set on that side. I always recommend starting your set on the weaker side first. When you have the most energy, those are things to kind of until things balance up like that. So there's different The other beauty of single leg stuff is you work in multiple planes. So you can work in the frontal plane, you can work laterally, you can work in diagonals, you can add rotations to it. So you can add a lot more variety to it. The downside of it is you can't load it as heavy as a squat. So from a pure strength standpoint, the squat is going to give you the most bang for its buck, but generally the best advice is do both. Do some squatting, do some lunging or split squats in different angles or different planes. And you kind of take care of everything from a lower body standpoint with the squat movement. So next we'll go into deadlift or hinging. And again, as we talked about, this is more where the pelvis is moving more horizontally, more forward and back. This tends to target more the posterior musculature, the low back, the glutes, the hamstrings, where the squat tends to focus a little more on the quads. But, realistically, they're all getting worked. Same kind of thing goes for deadlifting and squatting. Anybody can deadlift. I've had people post spinal fusions deadlift. I had a woman in that was 88 that, her goal was to deadlift 100 pounds, and we got her there. And so the key is finding the right type and right method for you. Plenty of variations and plenty of ways to go about it. So the deadlift is a little harder to teach. So that's why I like to teach the hinge motion, which is going to be this first link here, right below the cursor. So before you get into deadlifting, this is a simple kind of way you can learn how to hinge without rounding your back, with moving through the hips, and before you start adding weight to it. So again, the first variation I usually do is a single kettlebell or single dumbbell. Usually it's going to be on the ground between your legs, and you're going to hinge down, pick it up, drive through the hips and the glutes, keep the core tight. Think of like doing a plank, and then return it to its starting spot. From there, we can go into an RDL, which is where you're starting with the weight at the top portion of the lift rather than the ground. And then you're going to work down and back up with the same basic movement. This can be done with 2 dumbbells or a barbell. And generally, it's a little easier movement to start with. You'll also have single leg RDL, modified single leg RDL, which again, same thing as a lunge, can tease out side to side differences and can work on a little more stability. But again, the downside is you can't load them as heavy. So it's a good idea to work both. As you go to get stronger, you're going to get into the conventional and sumo deadlift movements. This is where you're pulling the weight up from the floor. So you're using a barbell. The weight is starting on the floor. You're pulling it to the top and returning it back down to the floor. The conventional does require a little more range of motion. So that's why the sumo is an option, which is where your feet are wider apart. You don't need as much range of motion. So for those that are limited and find yourself struggling to maintain proper form with conventional, you can try the sumo, or you can just go back to the RDL, or you can do what's called a rack pull, which is basically where you bring the weight up towards you, either by putting it on some boxes or in the rack in a gym, raising it and putting it on the pins of the rack and going from there. So you're not returning it all the way down to the floor. You're returning it to a surface that's higher than the floor, which doesn't require as much mobility, which is perfectly fine. I'd rather you pull the deadlift in a smaller range of motion, but do it correctly than try to force it and injure yourself or get out of good mechanics with that. So those are the 2 basic movements of the lower body. Again, the squat and the deadlift or the hinge. So upper body, we're going to get a little more complex. We're going to go into 4 basic movement patterns. That's going to be horizontal pressing, horizontal pulling, vertical pressing, and vertical pulling. So the names kind of tell you what they are, but we'll dive into these. So horizontal pressing, this is going to be your chest pressing. So bench press, push-ups, standing cable, and band presses. So this is actually having a high level of strength in this particular movement, has a high correlation with swing speed. There's this misnomer that bench pressing will tighten you up or reduce mobility, and and that's been disproven. But it actually has a high carryover to golf performance from the standpoint of swing speed. So the push up is a good variation to start with. And it's good just to learn the mechanics of the push up. And the benefit of the push up is kind of a whole body workout. It's basically a moving plank, so you get a lot of core involvement with that. But again, you're only loading with body weight. So at a certain point, if you want to get stronger, then you have to move into some kind of a bench press variation. Uh, the barbell bench press is going to be the main strength builder. This is going to be the one you can load the heaviest. And the same thing that this, play around with grip width on the bar, and make sure it's comfortable. You're going to drop down to around the nipple line on the chest, press it away, driving through the leg. So I like, if you watch a competitive power lifter bench press, they get their lower body involved, and so driving your feet through the ground and using that to drive up to improve how much weight you can press on that. The dumbbell bench press, again, you can start to isolate one arm from the other, so you can tease out some strength differences side to side. You're going to work a little more stability of the shoulder and the upper extremity, but again, you can't load it as much. So if you're going for pure strength, barbell bench press is the best thing. If you can't tolerate that, you don't feel comfortable with it, you can still get the dumbbell bench press and load it heavy. The other variation are some cable or band standing presses. This is beneficial if that's all you have. Obviously, you can still get a good workout, as well as you get a little more core involvement. You're standing, so you're using the ground, but you can't load that near as heavy as the dumbbell or the barbell bench presses. But it is an option that you can do. Horizontal pulling is going to be the opposite of horizontal pressing, and that's going to be your row variation. So again, we can get into the bent over barbell row, which is going to be the best variation to load heavy. What you're doing with these movements, these standing rows, is you're basically getting into your deadlift position and you're holding that and doing the motion. So it is a good strengthener of the low back from an isometric standpoint, because you're having to support your spine and your trunk in that position. So it is important to, again, go back to that hinge movement and really learn how to do that, because that's going to be the basis of these bent over rows. So again, make sure your weight, it's a weight you can handle, so you don't want your body moving all over the place. You want to stay pretty solid through the trunk and just have the arms move. But the barbell row is going to be the way you can load it the heaviest. And then you can go into your single arm dumbbell rows. Same principle with body form and positioning. So you can still load this fairly heavy. And again, this is going to tease out your side to side differences. And then you can get in some standing, cable, and band variations where you can start to add some rotation to it and get some core and get some, utilizing the ground, which will bring a little more full body involvement in it, but definitely can't load it as heavy from a pure rowing strength standpoint. So they all have their benefit. And in the beginning, you really want to focus on building as much strength, and then you can kind of get into these other variations as you go. Vertical pressing. This is going to be your overhead pressing, shoulder pressing. Not everybody necessarily gets to this. It's not as much carryover to the golf swing, but I do think it's important for shoulder health. And there are variations we can do if you have shoulder issues or have range of motion issues. But I do think it's a beneficial thing. Again, as with all of these, the barbell variation is going to be the one you can load the heaviest, but it is going to require the most mobility, overhead mobility. So if you do have issues with that, we can either go into a dumbbell press, or we can vary the plane we're working in, or a landmine press, which you'll see in the video, doesn't require you to go through full range of motion. So if you have any issues, history of shoulder injury, rotator cuff injury, surgeries, or just loss of range of motion, the landmine press is probably the best option for you, because you still get some pressing strength through that. And then if you can improve that range of motion and work up, great. Some people never get off the landmine press, and that's perfectly fine. Lastly, we have vertical pulling. So this is going to be your pull-ups, pull-down variations. And again, we're building strength through the lats, strength through the pulling muscles, strength through the back. I think everybody should strive to get some pull-ups. You may have to build up, you may have to add some bands to assist you. And you may have to utilize the pull down variations to build up your strength. So the benefit of the pull down variation is you can go single arm, you can vary hand position, which you can with pull ups to a degree as well. You have a lot more variation with these. And again, you want to make sure you're using a weight you can control the motion with, where the body's staying pretty solid and in control and the arms are doing the motion. So there's a lot of different options with that, but it's good to kind of balance that out. For most people, I like to add a little more pulling than pressing. So, usually for every one pressing exercise, I like to do 2 pulling, and this just kind of helps support posture. It helps balance out that anterior tightness that we tend to get into with sitting or driving all day. But there is still the need for that pressing strength as well for performance standards. So let's talk a little bit about strength and aging. So there's 2 main things that strength training can benefit us as we age, whether we're golfers or not. And one of those is osteopenia, osteoporosis. This is the loss of bone with age. It naturally happens to everybody. Some people, it happens at a faster rate, whether that's because of lifestyle. Females tend to lose more than males. But any type of weight-bearing and loaded weight-bearing exercises, so the base of that would be walking. The highest of that would be a loaded squat or deadlift, signals our body to make more bones, and especially in our weight-bearing bones, the bones of our spine, our lower limbs, to kind of mitigate that loss. So resistance training and strength training is important as we age for health factors as well, not just for keeping distance and or improving distance and swing speed and performance. The second thing is sarcopenia, and that's the muscle version of osteoporosis or osteopenia, which is the loss of muscle. Again, this happens naturally to us over time, but strength training is the best thing we have to fight against this. And we can significantly prevent this loss. We can slow the decline. We can even reverse some of these decline by consistent strength training. So it is important beyond, I just want to make these notes because beyond performance for golf, strength has significant benefits. And on top of this, it builds our resiliency and our tolerance to stress that life can put on our body. And that can be anything we do, whether it's lifting, carrying, pushing, pulling, playing with our kids or grandkids, being able to get back up and down off the ground, protecting us in a fall or a traumatic accident, things like that. Having muscle mass and having strength, there obviously is a huge benefit to performance in golf, but there's also a huge benefit to just safety, quality of life, functionality as well. So, I try to always preach to my clients that, yeah, we're doing this to improve your golf game, but you're going to see so many other, extra benefits from a consistent strength training program. So that's strength in a nutshell. Again, you'll have access to the PDF, so you can go through these videos and implement them into your program and into your training. And if you have any questions, you can always reach out to me at johnpaul@guidrypt.com.